At its height, the Mali Empire was larger than Western Europe. While knights jousted in France and the Black Death crept across England, an empire of 3 million square kilometers was running universities, regulating the world's gold supply, and building cities that scholars traveled thousands of miles to reach. We remember Rome. We remember Greece. But the kingdom that may have done more to shape the medieval world's wealth than either of them has been almost entirely erased from the story we tell ourselves about human civilization. Mali was not a footnote. It was not a footnote to a footnote. It was, for more than 2 centuries, the beating economic heart of the known world, and its ruler Mansa Musa commanded more personal wealth than any person before or since, a fortune so vast that modern economists cannot agree on a number large enough to describe it. Why does almost no one know his name? Join us as we restore the Mali Empire to its rightful place in the history of the world. Long before the name Mali echoed across the known world, before gold and salt made kings into legends, the land itself was writing the conditions for greatness. Picture West Africa as a series of horizontal bands, each one a different world. In the far north, the Sahara stretches in merciless silence, a sea of sand and stone that most living things cannot survive. Moving southward, the desert softens into the Sahel, a fragile transition zone of sparse grasses and scattered acacia trees where rain arrives unpredictably, where life clings on by negotiation rather than abundance. Further south still, the Sahel yields to open savanna, the broad woodland grasslands that would become the heartland of empire. And beyond that, the dense tropical forests of the coast, humid and impenetrable, closing off the south like a great green wall. This middle band, the savanna region historians call the Western Sudan, was the stage upon which everything would unfold. Through it ran 2 rivers that changed everything. The Niger, one of Africa's longest waterways, arcs through the region in an enormous inland curve, creating a vast interior delta where floodwaters spread across thousands of square miles each year, depositing rich alluvial soil and sustaining enormous concentrations of fish, birds, and cultivated crops. To the west, the Senegal River carved its own corridor toward the Atlantic, linking communities across hundreds of miles. Together, these 2 river systems form the arteries of a civilization still taking shape. The Mande-speaking peoples who settled these river valleys were not passive inhabitants of their landscape. By roughly 2,000 years ago, they had developed sophisticated agricultural practices, cultivating sorghum and millet in the fertile soils along the riverbanks. They kept cattle, sheep, and goats, moving seasonally with their herds. And critically, they had mastered iron. Iron tools meant more productive farming. Iron weapons meant more effective defense and more effective conquest. But perhaps the most decisive factor was geography's oldest trick: scarcity creates trade. The Sahara, for all its hostility, was not an impenetrable barrier. It was a road. Berber and later Tuareg camel caravans had been crossing it for centuries, carrying salt from the great desert deposits at Tagaza southward, and returning northward with gold, ivory, and enslaved people drawn from sub-Saharan Africa. The Savannah people sat precisely at the southern terminus of these routes, perfectly positioned to become the brokers of a continental exchange. What happens when you place an agriculturally productive people, armed with iron, at the crossroads of the ancient world's most lucrative long-distance trade network? You get the conditions for something extraordinary. The empires that would follow did not emerge from nowhere. They grew from this soil, these rivers, and these roads. The story of Mali begins here in the geography itself. For centuries before Mali's name was ever spoken, another empire held the Western Sudan in its grip. Its builders were the Soninke people, a Mande-speaking society who looked at the crossroads of the gold and salt trade and saw not merely commerce but power. They called their kingdom Wagadu. The Arabs who encountered it through trade and conquest called it Ghana, the title borne by its ruler. By the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, this state had already begun consolidating control over the most lucrative exchange network in the medieval world. The logic of Ghana's dominance was elegantly simple. Gold came from the forest regions to the south, particularly the Bambouk and Bura goldfields, territories rich in alluvial deposits. Salt came from the Saharan mines at Tagaza to the north, a commodity so essential in the pre-refrigeration world that it was valued nearly equal to gold by weight. Ghana sat between these two worlds, and its rulers understood exactly what that position was worth. Every caravan passing through Ghanaian territory paid tribute. Merchants paid taxes on goods entering the kingdom and taxes again on goods leaving it. The king maintained a monopoly on gold nuggets, allowing only gold dust to circulate among traders, keeping the larger reserves under royal control. It was one of history's earliest and most effective commodity management systems. The royal court at Kumbisala, by the 11th century one of the largest cities in Africa, reflected this accumulated wealth in its architecture, its armies, and its ceremony. But empires built on trade are only as stable as the roots that sustain them. And in the 11th century, Ghana faced a pressure it could not absorb. The Almoravids, a reformist Islamic movement originating among the Senhasha Berbers of the Western Sahara, swept northward into Morocco and southward toward the Sahel with equal intensity. Their relationship with Ghana was complicated, a mixture of religious pressure, commercial rivalry, and periodic military conflict. In 1076, Almoravid forces sacked Kumbi Saleh. The blow was not immediately fatal, but it was profound. Ghana's authority over the surrounding chieftaincies had always depended on projecting strength. Once that strength was visibly shaken, the centrifugal forces held in check for generations began pulling outward. Over the following century, the empire fragmented. Tributary peoples reasserted independence. Rival chieftaincies, long suppressed, rose to claim their own pieces of the trade network. The Soninke heartland contracted. By the late 12th century, what had once commanded an empire was reduced to one power among many, jostling for survival in a fractured political landscape. Into that vacuum stepped the peoples who would build something even larger. Among the successor states and struggling chieftaincies of the former Ghanaian world, the Mandinka were watching, waiting, and quietly gathering their strength. The age of Mali was coming. But first, it would arrive through fire. To understand the empire that would one day stun the medieval world, one must first understand the land and people from which it grew. Long before any king rose to unite them, the Mandinka lived in the fertile corridor of the upper Niger River Valley, a region of savanna grasslands, seasonal rains, and rivers that served as both highway and lifeline. This was the Mande heartland, a geography that shaped a culture as surely as any deliberate design. The Mandinka organized themselves around a foundational structure, 12 core clans known as the Dua. Names like Keita, Kouyaté, and Traoré were not merely family labels. They were declarations of identity, linking a person to ancestors, obligations, and a place within the wider social order. Each clan carried its own histories, its own alliances, and its own jealousies. In a world without written records, lineage was everything. And who preserved those lineages? The griots, known in the Mandinka language as jealous. These were no ordinary storytellers. The jealous occupied a distinct hereditary caste, trained from childhood to memorize genealogies stretching back dozens of generations, to recite the deeds of warriors and the names of kings, to carry the living memory of entire communities inside their minds. A griot attached to a noble family served as historian, diplomat, praise singer, and counselor all at once. When a great chief wished to remind rivals of his ancestry, he sent his jelly to speak. When alliances needed negotiating, the jelly carried the words. The oral tradition they maintained was not folklore. It was the archive. This society was also a carefully stratified one. At the top sat the nobles, the Horon, freeborn men of distinguished lineage from whom chiefs and warriors were drawn. Below them moved the freemen, farmers, and herders who formed the productive core of Mandinka villages. Then came the artisan castes, the blacksmiths, leatherworkers, and weavers, groups whose specialized skills set them apart and made them simultaneously necessary and socially distinct. At the base of this hierarchy were enslaved people, drawn from warfare and raiding, whose labor underwrote the prosperity of the classes above them. By the 12th century, as the old Ghanaian order continued its slow collapse, the Mandinka chieftaincies of this region were far from unified. Rivalry defined them. Small kingdoms competed for fertile land, for access to trade routes, and for the loyalty of subordinate villages. Chiefs rose and fell across a landscape that rewarded the bold and punished the complacent. The Keita clan, settled in a region called Kangaba near the Bure goldfields, was one among these competing powers, not yet supreme, not yet legendary. But geography, gold, and a particular kind of ambition have a way of selecting their instruments. The stage was already set. What it still required was a story terrible enough and triumphant enough to forge a nation from scattered clans. That story was about to begin. From the wreckage of the old Ghanaian order, something dangerous had emerged. Not a new empire built on trade and tolerance, but a kingdom forged in iron and fear. This was the Sasso, and at its head stood a man whose name would become, across the Western Sudan, a synonym for dread. Sumanguru Kante was a blacksmith king, a leader from the smith caste who understood that mastery of metal meant mastery of men. The Sasso had positioned themselves shrewdly in the aftermath of Ghana's decline, expanding their territory across the Sahel and absorbing the fractured polities that had once orbited the old empire. By the early 13th century, Sumanguru had consolidated this inheritance and was pushing outward, hungry for more. What made him so formidable was not merely his armies. It was his reputation. Across the oral traditions that preserved this era, Sumanguru emerges as something beyond a conqueror. He was said to be a sorcerer king, a master of occult power, a man who kept a tower chamber filled with the instruments of his magic, including the skins of enemy kings stretched across his walls. Whether these accounts are literal truth or the accumulated mythology of a terrorized population, they tell us something important. People believed he could not be killed by ordinary means. And that belief was itself a weapon. For the Mandinka clans of the Upper Niger, the arrival of Soso power was catastrophic. Sumanguru turned his campaign of expansion directly upon them, sweeping through the Mande heartland and installing himself as overlord of territories that Keita and their neighbors had long considered their own. Villages burned. Chiefs were humiliated or killed. Tribute was extracted with brutal efficiency. Most devastating of all was what he did to the royal lines. According to the griot traditions, Sumanguru systematically massacred the princes of the Mandinka clans, eliminating potential rivals before they could gather followers or raise armies. Of the Keita line, only a small number survived. One of them, Nare Maghan Konate, had sons, but they were, in the accounting of the powerful, nobody. A collection of heirs without an inheritance. The subjugation was thorough, but it was also the kind of thorough that contains within it the seeds of its own undoing. Sumanguru demanded too much and left too little. Pride survives even the most systematic oppression, and in the memories preserved by the jealous, the grief of those years hardened into something purposeful. The Mandinka were not a people who had forgotten what they once were. Whispers began moving between villages, along trade paths, through the careful conversations of griots. There had to be someone. Some figure, perhaps overlooked precisely because he seemed harmless, who might yet become the instrument of liberation. Among the surviving Keita sons was one who had been largely dismissed by Sumanguru's calculations. A young man said to have been crippled in childhood, thought by many to be no threat to anyone. That assessment was about to prove catastrophically wrong. The tyrant had built his dominion on the conviction that he had crushed every alternative. He had accounted for armies and kings and rival sorcerers. What he had not accounted for was a name that people were beginning, quietly and then less quietly, to speak aloud. A name that would soon be carried on the lips of griots all the way to the battlefield. That name was Sundiata. He was born, according to the griots, into a destiny already spoken. The jealous of the Mandinka say that hunters came to Naremagan Konate bearing a prophecy that a woman of unconventional appearance would bear him a son of incomparable greatness. When a Mandinka chief from the Kande clan arrived bearing gifts and his daughter Sogalon, a woman described as hunched and plain, the king honored the prophecy and took her as a wife. From this union came a boy named Sundiata Keita. The child was a disappointment. Worse than that, he was, by any outward measure, a humiliation. He could not walk. His legs refused him, folding beneath his weight, leaving him to drag himself across the earth while other boys ran and played around him. His mother endured the mockery of the royal court. Rivals whispered that this broken child could never fulfill any prophecy worth keeping. His own father died before he could see whether the jealous had been wrong. Then came the moment the epic of Sundiata has carried across 8 centuries. Sundiata, perhaps 7 years old, perhaps older, accounts differ, asked for an iron rod. When it was brought to him, he seized it. He pressed it into the earth. And then, through effort that the griots describe as almost supernatural in its intensity, he stood. The iron rod bent under the force of his rising. But Sundiata rose. Here is where the historian and the storyteller must make their peace with one another. The written record of this period is thin. Arab chronicles mention Sundiata obliquely, confirming a leader of the Mandinka who rose to challenge Soso power. The specifics, the rod, the miraculous rising, the prophecies spoken at birth, belong to the oral tradition preserved and refined across generations of jealous. What they record is not always what a court archivist would note, but it carries its own truth. These stories survived because they meant something essential about the man and the movement he represented. What is certain is that Sundiata did not remain at home to enjoy his recovery. Whether through political calculation, genuine danger from rivals, or both, he went into exile with his mother and siblings. They moved from court to court across the western Sudan, spending years as dependents on the generosity of foreign kings. They stayed among the Sise of Mema, among the rulers of Ouagadougou, among chieftains whose names the epic recites with careful respect. Everywhere Sundiata went, he made an impression. He was a skilled hunter, a natural leader, a young man whose presence commanded attention even when his circumstances commanded none. Those years away from the Mandinka heartland were not wasted. In the courts of other peoples, Sundiata learned how power was assembled. He accumulated obligations, friendships, and alliances. When word reached him that the Mandinka clans were groaning under Sumanguru's domination, that envoys had been sent to find him and beg his return, he had already spent years building the foundation of what would come next. The coalition he assembled was deliberate and patient. Clan by clan, chieftain by chieftain, Sundiata gathered the fractured peoples of the Upper Niger around a single purpose. The prophecies surrounding him, his miraculous recovery, his years of survival, his evident charisma, these were not incidental to the political project. They were the project. In a world where legitimacy flowed as much from spiritual authority as from military strength, Sundiata's story was itself a weapon. People did not simply follow a general. They followed someone the universe had marked for greatness. By the early 1230s, the coalition was taking shape. Warriors from a dozen traditions were gathering behind the lion prince of the Keita clan. The man Sumanguru had dismissed as a crippled nobody had returned with allies, with momentum, and with a story so powerful that even Sumanguru's reputation for sorcery could not contain it. The reckoning was coming. And somewhere on the plains of the western Sudan, the armies were beginning to move toward a battlefield that would determine, for centuries to come, who held this remarkable corner of the world. The armies moved in the dry season of approximately 1235, when the grasses of the western Sudan had turned brittle and the sky hung pale and immense above the savannah. Sundiata's coalition, drawn from the Mandinka clans and their allied chieftains, marched toward the Soso heartland with a purpose that had been building for years. Word traveled ahead of them like smoke. The Lion Prince had come home, and he had not come alone. Sumanguru Kante was not a man who waited passively for his enemies. He had built the Soso kingdom through force and through fear, and the sources describe him as a warrior king who understood military power intimately. He also understood something else, that this approaching army was different from anything he had faced before. It carried with it not just spears and cavalry, but an idea. The idea that his reign could be broken. The two forces met near Karina, a place in the upper Niger region whose exact location has never been definitively fixed, but whose name has echoed through West African memory for 8 centuries. What happened there became one of the foundational moments of the medieval Sahel, told and retold until it gathered layers of meaning far beyond the collision of two armies on a dusty plain. The griots say that before and during the battle, Sumanguru's power was rooted in his command of the spirit world. He was a blacksmith king, and blacksmiths in Mande tradition occupied a category apart from ordinary humanity. They worked with fire and iron, elements that carried their own sacred danger. Sumanguru's sorcery was said to be so formidable that conventional weapons could not harm him. Arrows fell away. Blades turned aside. He was, in the language of his world, beyond ordinary killing. So Sundiata's forces turned to extraordinary means. The epic tradition holds that a woman, some versions say it was Sundiata's sister who had infiltrated Sumanguru's court, discovered the secret of his vulnerability. His power could be broken only by a special talisman, an arrow, or a spur tipped with the claw of a white rooster. In a world where spiritual authority was inseparable from political authority, undermining a king's invincibility was not superstition. It was strategy. The arrow found its mark. Whether it was a literal shaft that wounded Sumanguru or a symbolic act that shattered the psychological certainty of his protection, the effect was the same. The Saso forces, who had followed a man they believed untouchable, found themselves following a man suddenly revealed as mortal. The coalition's assault pressed forward. The Saso lines broke. What happened to Sumanguru himself remains one of the great unresolved questions of the period. He was not captured, and no reliable account records his death. He simply vanished. Some traditions say he fled into the hills of Kulakoro and disappeared into the rock itself. Others hold that he retreated, wounded, into obscurity and died unremarked. The griots, who had little interest in commemorating his end, seemed content to let him dissolve from the story at the moment of his defeat. A man whose power was his presence simply ceased to have either. In the silence that followed Karina, Sundiata moved. The Saso kingdom, which had dominated the region through intimidation and military might, lost its coherence almost immediately after losing its king. Subject peoples who had bent under Sumanguru's rule now looked to the man who had done what seemed impossible. When Sundiata entered the Saso capital, he did not merely inherit a vacancy. At Kurukan Fuga, the great assembly that the oral tradition places shortly after the victory, the allied chiefs and clan leaders gathered to ratify something new. Sundiata was proclaimed Mansa, King of Kings, ruler of a confederation that would grow into the Mali Empire. The terms of how different peoples would live together, govern themselves, and relate to one another were spoken aloud and committed to memory. A battle had been fought. A kingdom had fallen. And from its ashes, one of the largest and wealthiest empires in human history had just drawn its first breath. What Sundiata built in the years that followed would define the Western Sudan for 2 centuries to come. The dust had barely settled over Karina when Sundiata turned his attention to a question more difficult than any battle. How does a man govern what he has won? Victory over Sumanguru had united a coalition of clans and peoples whose loyalty was personal, whose traditions were distinct, and whose cooperation could dissolve as quickly as it had formed. A confederation built on the shared enemy of a tyrant needed something more durable to hold it together. Sometime around 1236, Sundiata summoned the clan leaders, chieftains, and representatives of the allied peoples to a great assembly at a place called Kurukan Fuga, near Kangaba in the Upper Niger region. What emerged from that gathering would prove to be one of the most remarkable political documents of the medieval world. The Kurukan Fuga, the charter spoken into existence at that assembly, was not written down. It was memorized, recited, and carried forward by the griots whose entire purpose was the preservation of collective memory. That it survived at all is a testament to the extraordinary discipline of that oral tradition. Generations of historians working with those oral records and a formal transcription process completed only in the 20th century have revealed its contents. What they found was a sophisticated framework of rights and responsibilities that governed the relationship between clans, defined social obligations, regulated commerce and marriage, and established the political architecture of the new empire. The charter addressed the duties of free men and the protections owed to women. It regulated the treatment of those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. It assigned specific roles and privileges to the blacksmith clans, the griot families, and the agricultural communities, recognizing that a functioning society depended on all of them fulfilling their distinct obligations. Disputes between clans would be resolved through established processes rather than private violence. In its recognition that different groups held different rights and responsibilities within a single political order, the Kurukan Fuga anticipated principles that much of the world would not formalize for centuries. Sundiata then turned to the question of administration. He established Niani, situated near the confluence of the Niger and Sankarani rivers, as the imperial capital. The location was deliberate. Niani sat at a crossroads of agricultural wealth and trade routes, a city that could feed itself and tax the commerce that flowed around it. At its height, Arab travelers would describe a city of considerable size and sophistication, the nerve center of an empire stretching across millions of square miles. To govern that empire, Sundiata divided it into provinces, each placed under an appointed governor who answered to the Mansa. This was a critical innovation. Rather than leaving conquered territories to manage themselves under traditional rulers who might drift toward independence, Sundiata inserted imperial authority directly into the administrative structure. Local customs were respected, but the chain of obligation ran upward to Niani. The early years of Mali's expansion pushed the empire's borders outward in nearly every direction. Gold-producing territories came under Malian control. Trade routes that had once lined Soso coffers now fed the imperial treasury. Subject peoples who paid tribute and provided soldiers discovered that Malian rule, shaped by the Kurukan Fuga's protections, was considerably less brutal than what had come before. Sundiata had done something that transcended conquest. He had built institutions. And institutions, unlike individual kings, have the capacity to outlast the men who create them. The Mali Empire that took shape in those founding years would endure for more than 2 centuries. Its greatest test of longevity and its greatest moment of global spectacle would come not under Sundiata, but under a king whose name would travel from the Niger River to the courts of Europe and the markets of Cairo. That story was still a century away. What made Mali rich? The question seems simple. The answer is geography. Sundiata's empire had not merely conquered people. It had conquered landscape, and that landscape happened to sit atop 2 of the most consequential commodities in the medieval world. Gold flowed from the earth in quantities that would astonish even the most seasoned Arab merchants who came to witness it firsthand. And salt, that essential mineral without which human bodies fail and food rots, lay buried in the Saharan north in deposits so vast they were literally quarried like stone. The gold fields of Bambouk, located between the Senegal and Falémé rivers, had been producing wealth for centuries before Sundiata was born. The Bure fields further east added to this abundance. Later, the Akan-speaking peoples of the forest zones to the south would contribute yet another vein of production to Mali's golden portfolio. The Malian state did not mine the gold itself. It did something more intelligent. It taxed it. Every nugget and every grain of gold dust that moved through imperial territory generated revenue for the Mansa's treasury. The actual mining was left to local communities, who operated under arrangements that made the empire wealthy without requiring it to get its hands dirty. The salt trade operated as a perfect counterweight. The mines at Tagaza, set deep in the Saharan waste roughly 500 miles north of Timbuktu, produced slabs of rock salt so large and so pure that their reputation spread across the known world. Arab geographers recorded the strange sight of buildings constructed from salt blocks in a place where wood was too precious to waste. Tuareg and Berber caravans loaded those slabs onto camels and drove them southward across some of the most punishing terrain on earth, knowing that what was abundant in the north was desperately scarce in the south. At the center of this exchange stood Mali. The empire occupied the precise geographic position where the gold-rich south and the salt-rich north had no choice but to meet. Malian merchants, operating under imperial protection along well-established routes, facilitated the exchange. North African traders carried salt and luxury goods like copper, cloth, and horses down across the Sahara. West African traders sent gold, cola nuts, and enslaved people northward in return. Mali taxed the transaction in both directions. The sophistication of this system extended beyond simple barter. Multiple currencies circulated through Mali's commercial networks. Gold dust, measured in standardized weights, served as the premium medium for large transactions. Cowrie shells, imported from the Indian Ocean trade via North Africa, functioned as small denomination currency for everyday commerce. Copper ingots provided yet another store of value. This layered monetary system allowed trade to operate at every scale, from a farmer buying grain in a local market to a merchant negotiating a caravan worth thousands of gold weights. The imperial treasury collected tariffs on goods entering and leaving key trading cities. Every load of salt passing through a Malian checkpoint paid its due. Every parcel of gold heading north did the same. Foreign merchants operating in Malian cities traded under rules set by imperial officials who understood that predictable taxation was more profitable than extortion. Word spread. Merchants from North Africa, Egypt, and beyond learned that the roads of Mali were safe and its rulers could be trusted. This was not accident. It was policy, deliberately maintained and carefully enforced. By the close of the 13th century, the empire that Sundiata had built on battlefield and charter had become one of the wealthiest polities on earth. The question was who would inherit it and what they would do with a fortune that was still, as yet, only beginning to grow. Sundiata Keita died around 1255. The precise circumstances remain unclear, swallowed by the same oral traditions that preserved his legend. What is certain is that the man who had built the empire left behind no clean mechanism for passing it on. The throne passed first to his son, Mansa Musa, and for a time the empire held its shape. Uli proved a capable ruler, extending Mali's reach northward toward the Saharan trade routes and becoming, according to Arab sources, the first Malian Mansa to perform the Hajj to Mecca. His pilgrimage announced Mali's presence to the Islamic world in a way that commerce alone could not. Here was a West African king wealthy enough to cross a continent, pious enough to complete the journey, and powerful enough to return home with his throne intact. But Uli's death opened a wound that would not easily close. His successors, Mansa Wadi and then Mansa Khalifa, each failed spectacularly in their own way. Khalifa proved not merely incompetent but reportedly dangerous, described by Arab chroniclers as a ruler who amused himself by shooting arrows at his own subjects. A man like that could not hold an empire built on trade and consent. He was removed, and the throne fell into disorder. What happened next stands as one of the more remarkable turns in Mali's story. A man named Sakura, who had been born into slavery and risen through the imperial household, seized control of the empire. By rights of blood and lineage, he had no claim whatsoever. By rights of competence, he may have had the strongest claim of his generation. Sakura ruled with iron efficiency. He pushed Mali's borders outward, launching campaigns that brought the trading city of Gao and significant portions of the Niger Bend under Malian control. The empire grew. The treasury filled. Trade routes expanded. A freed slave had done what the legitimate heirs could not. He had held the empire together and made it larger. He too performed the Hajj, though fate caught him on the return journey. He was killed near the Red Sea coast, his authority ending as abruptly as it had begun. With Sakura gone, the Keita bloodline reasserted itself. The throne returned to Sundiata's lineage through a succession of rulers, eventually arriving at a figure who has captured the imagination of historians and adventurers alike. Mansa Abubakari II came to power around 1300 and inherited an empire at the height of its geographic reach. But Abubakari's gaze turned west, toward the Atlantic Ocean. According to the account preserved by his successor and later recorded by the Arab scholar Al-Umari, Abubakari became obsessed with what lay beyond the sea. He dispatched an initial fleet of 2,000 boats into the Atlantic, a staggering number that suggests enormous resources and genuine conviction. Most, perhaps all, did not return. A single captain brought back reports of a great current pulling ships westward and downward, from which there was no escape. Any rational ruler might have stopped there. Abubakari did not. He abdicated his throne in 1312, handed power to his deputy, and launched himself into the Atlantic at the head of another vast fleet. He was never seen again. Did Abubakari reach the Americas nearly 2 centuries before Columbus? Historians remain deeply divided. No archaeological evidence has confirmed the contact, and the currents he would have encountered made survival uncertain at best. Yet the story persists, because the man who told it had no obvious reason to lie, and because the empire Abubakari left behind was about to enter its most magnificent age under the one ruler who would make Mali's name echo across the entire medieval world. The man who inherited Abubakari's throne in 1312 had a name that would travel farther than any fleet. Musa Keita, known to history by his full imperial title, Mansa Musa Keita I, Lord of the Mines of Wangara, took power not by conquest or intrigue, but by appointment. He had served as Abubakari's deputy, the designated steward of the empire while its restless ruler chased the horizon. When that ruler vanished into the Atlantic and did not return, Musa stepped forward. He was, by all accounts, ready. His full title alone tells a story. Lord of the Mines of Wangara. This was not decoration. The gold fields of Wangara, whose precise location remained a closely guarded secret even from Arab traders, supplied the lifeblood of trans-Saharan commerce. To be their lord was to hold the economic pulse of an entire hemisphere's trade. Musa understood this from the beginning. He understood, too, that power without legitimacy was fragile, and that in the world he inhabited, legitimacy flowed from 2 sources: military strength and Islamic piety. He possessed both. In the early years of his reign, Musa set about consolidating what he had inherited and expanding its edges. Mali's armies pushed outward, absorbing territories and city-states that had remained semi-independent under previous rulers. The western reaches of the empire stretched toward the Atlantic coastline. To the north, Malian authority pressed against the fringes of the Sahara. To the east, the great bend of the Niger River drew the empire's boundary in a sweeping arc. At its territorial peak under Musa, Mali covered roughly 2,000 miles from west to east, encompassing an area comparable to Western Europe. Governing such a territory demanded more than ambition. Musa organized the empire into provinces, each administered by a governor called a farba, appointed by the Mansa and accountable to the throne. He maintained a professional military capable of projecting force across vast distances, and he cultivated relationships with the Islamic scholars and merchants who served as the connective tissue of Saharan civilization. Cities like Timbuktu and Jenne were not merely trading posts under his watch. They were becoming centers of learning, faith, and culture. And beneath all of it ran the current of Musa's faith. He was, by every contemporary account, a deeply observant Muslim. He prayed. He studied. He surrounded himself with scholars and clerics. He observed Islamic law and expected his court to do the same. For Musa, faith was not a political instrument. It was the organizing principle of his life. And there was one obligation, one pillar of Islam, that he had not yet fulfilled. The Hajj. Every Muslim who possesses the means is required to make the pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their lifetime. Musa possessed the means beyond any monarch alive. He had spent the first decade of his reign building the administrative foundation that would allow him to leave, appointing capable subordinates and securing the borders. By the early 1320s, the empire was stable enough, the treasury full enough, the organization sound enough. Musa began to plan a journey that would take him thousands of miles across the Sahara, through Egypt, and into the holy cities of Arabia. He planned it not merely as an act of personal devotion, but as a proclamation, a demonstration to the entire Islamic world of what Mali had become under his rule. What followed would reshape how the world understood Africa, alter the economies of 3 continents, and burn Musa's name into the memory of every civilization that encountered him. The caravan was almost ready. In the summer of 1324, the city of Niani witnessed something it had never seen before and would never see again. From the capital of the greatest empire in Africa, a procession assembled that stretched beyond the sight of any single observer. 60,000 people. Soldiers, scholars, servants, heralds, and administrators. Wives and attendants numbering in the hundreds. 12,000 enslaved men alone, each one dressed in Persian silk and carrying a golden staff. And threading through this human river, 80 camels bearing their burdens with methodical patience, each animal carrying 300 pounds of pure gold dust. The mathematics of that caravan still stagger the imagination. 24,000 pounds of gold moving across the Sahara on the backs of 80 animals. This was not tribute. This was not an army's war chest. This was generosity in motion, a portable treasury carried openly through the most dangerous terrain on earth, because Mansa Musa understood that the pilgrimage was also a performance. The crossing of the Sahara was brutal, regardless of one's wealth. The heat was absolute, the distances punishing, the logistics of feeding and watering such a column a daily crisis. Yet the caravan moved, following established trade routes, stopping at oases that had served merchants for centuries. And in July of 1324, Musa arrived in Cairo. Egypt had seen powerful men before, but Cairo had never seen anything quite like this. The Mamluk Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad received Musa with ceremony befitting a foreign monarch, and Musa responded with generosity that went so far beyond protocol it bordered on spectacle. He distributed gold throughout the city with breathtaking liberality. To the Sultan himself, to court officials, to merchants, to ordinary citizens encountered on the streets, Musa gave and gave and gave. Contemporary Arab historians recorded the moment with a mixture of awe and alarm. One chronicler wrote that Musa's gifts flooded Cairo, leaving no emir, palace official, or notable without a gift of gold. The economic consequences were catastrophic. Gold, in the medieval world, derived its value from scarcity. When Musa released his treasury into Cairo's markets, he did not merely surprise the local economy. He broke it. The sudden influx of gold depressed the metal's value so severely that Cairo's gold-based markets would not recover for more than a decade. Some economists have estimated the inflation persisted for 12 years. A man had arrived from a kingdom most Egyptians could not have located on a map, and in the span of weeks, he had altered the monetary foundation of one of the world's great cities simply by being generous. From Cairo, the caravan moved onward through the Sinai and into Arabia. Musa visited Medina before completing the final approach to Mecca, fulfilling his obligation at the Grand Mosque and walking the paths that every devout Muslim seeks to walk once before death. He spent time in the holy cities, meeting scholars, absorbing the religious atmosphere of the faith's spiritual center, and acquiring something he had long desired. He convinced the celebrated Andalusian architect and poet Abu Ishaq es-Sahili to return with him to Mali, a recruitment that would transform the physical landscape of the empire's cities. The return journey brought a quieter reckoning. Musa eventually understood the damage his generosity had inflicted on Cairo's economy. In a gesture that was practical, politically shrewd, and perhaps quietly humbling, he borrowed gold back from Cairo's merchants at interest, deliberately removing currency from circulation to help stabilize the markets he had destabilized. The man who had flooded the world's gold supply now worked to contain the flood. He arrived home having completed the obligation every Muslim aspires to. But he brought back more than spiritual fulfillment. He brought an architect, relationships with Islamic scholars, and something no amount of gold could purchase: visibility. Every court, every trading house, every cartographer who had heard the reports from Cairo now knew that somewhere in the vast interior of Africa sat a kingdom of incomprehensible wealth. The maps of the known world were about to change. How does one measure a fortune beyond measure? Modern economists and historians have tried. The figures they produce are, in their own way, as disorienting as the original events. Some analysts have placed Mansa Musa's net worth at $400 billion in contemporary terms. Others have abandoned the exercise entirely, concluding that his wealth was simply incalculable, that the gold fields of Bambouk and Bure produced at such volumes, and that Mali controlled so completely the trans-Saharan trade in both gold and salt, that applying a modern number to it misses the point entirely. The honest answer may be that Musa's wealth existed at a scale that defeats comparison. Yet the comparisons are irresistible. The Medici family, who would come to define European financial power in the 15th century, controlled enormous banking networks and dressed their patronage in marble and paint. Kublai Khan commanded an empire larger than any before it. In our own era, the wealthiest individuals on Earth have accumulated hundreds of billions through technology and industry. Against all of them, historians consistently position Musa at or beyond the apex. What separates him is not merely quantity but structural dominance. He did not participate in the gold economy. He was the gold economy. Mali produced roughly half of the world's gold supply during his reign, and it all moved through him. The consequences of the Cairo episode continued rippling outward long after Musa's caravan had crossed back into the Sahara. Mediterranean merchants who had never traveled within 1,000 miles of Mali watched the gold markets destabilize and began asking questions. Arab traders carried accounts of the pilgrimage northward and westward. The name of Mansa Musa, already spoken with respect along trans-Saharan routes, now entered the consciousness of European courts. The most striking evidence of this transformation appears in a Catalan atlas produced in 1375, 50 years after the Hajj, a full generation after Musa's death. The atlas, created by the Majorcan cartographer Abraham Crescus, depicts the known world with a specificity that reflects decades of accumulated geographic knowledge. And there, seated in the interior of Africa, is a crowned figure robed in gold, holding a golden orb or nugget in his outstretched hand. The inscription identifies him as Musa Meli, Lord of the Guinea Gold. The image captures something real. Even half a century later, in the workshops of European mapmakers working from second-hand accounts, Musa remained the defining symbol of African wealth and power. This was new. Medieval European cartography had rendered the African interior as vague territory, populated more by legend than by verified geography. The Catalan atlas changed that relationship. Mali was now a named place with a named ruler depicted with the visual vocabulary reserved for significant monarchs. The empire had achieved something rare and durable. It had impressed itself onto the geographic imagination of a civilization that had previously ignored it. North African perception shifted as well. Scholars and merchants who had always understood Mali's commercial importance now grasped its cultural ambitions. The presence of Abu Ishaq Saheli in Timbuktu, raising new mosques in fired brick and Sudano-Sahelian architecture, signaled that Musa intended his empire to be legible to the wider Islamic world on its own terms. A kingdom that had made the world's gold now made the world's maps. The richest man who ever lived had turned his wealth into something more permanent than currency, into reputation, into geography, into history. What he would do with that reputation in the years that followed would define not only his reign, but the memory of an entire civilization. He returned to Mali carrying more than memories of Mecca. In his entourage walked a man who would change the physical face of an empire. Abu Ishaq Saheli was an Andalusian poet and architect from Granada, a scholar of refined sensibility who had encountered Musa during the Hajj and accepted an invitation that would define both their legacies. The sum Musa reportedly paid him, roughly 200 pounds of gold, speaks to how seriously the emperor valued what al-Sahili brought. Not merely technical skill, but a direct connection to the architectural traditions of the broader Islamic world. What al-Sahili found in Mali was a land that built in wood and dried mud brick, sturdy materials suited to the climate, but invisible to the wider Muslim imagination. What he introduced was fired brick construction and the rectilinear forms of North African Islamic architecture. The difference was profound. Buildings that had once blended into the earth now rose with permanence and authority. The most lasting product of this collaboration was the Jingariber Mosque in Timbuktu, constructed around 1327. It still stands today, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Its characteristic towers studded with protruding wooden beams that serve both structural and maintenance purposes, allowing workers to scale the walls each year to replaster the facade. The mosque could accommodate several thousand worshippers. It was not merely a place of prayer, but a declaration, visible to every caravan arriving across the Sahara, that Timbuktu was now a city of consequence within the Islamic world. Musa did not stop there. A great mosque rose at Gao, the eastern city that anchored his empire's reach toward the Niger Bend. A royal palace took shape at Niani, his capital, incorporating the new architectural grammar al-Sahili had introduced. Across the empire, construction became policy. To build in the manner of Cairo and Fez was to announce belonging to a civilization that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Morocco to the courts of Central Asia. Yet Musa was shrewd enough to understand that architecture alone would not sustain what he was building. Books arrived in Timbuktu by the camel load. Scholars followed, drawn by patronage and reputation, settling in a city that was rapidly developing the infrastructure of Islamic learning. Libraries, manuscript collections, a culture of study and debate. The legal traditions of the Maliki school of Islamic jurisprudence took root in Malian courts, shaping how disputes were resolved, how commerce was regulated, how the empire administered itself. Islam spread most decisively among the Malian elite. Merchants, administrators, and nobles adopted the faith with an enthusiasm that was partly spiritual and partly practical, since literacy in Arabic opened doors throughout the trade networks of the Islamic world. But the empire was vast, and its population diverse. In villages beyond the capitals, traditional animist beliefs continued alongside the new faith, their coexistence a pragmatic accommodation that Mali's rulers generally permitted rather than contested. The empire did not demand conversion so much as it modeled aspiration. This layered religious landscape, Orthodox Islam at the court, and something older and more syncretic in the countryside, would remain a defining characteristic of West African Islamic civilization for centuries. Musa had created not a theocracy but a cultural framework, one in which scholarship, commerce, and faith reinforced one another. By the 1330s, Timbuktu was transforming from a trading post into something approaching a university city. The institutions Musa planted there would outlast his empire, outlast his dynasty, and outlast the memory of his name in much of the world. What grew from those foundations would eventually draw scholars from across the Muslim world and make one Malian city synonymous with the very idea of distant, unreachable knowledge. Before Mansa Musa's architects broke ground on its great mosque, Timbuktu was little more than a seasonal stopping point. Tuareg nomads had established a well there sometime around 1100, using it as a reliable camp during their summer migrations across the southern Sahara. The name itself, in some traditions, derives from an elderly woman named Buktu who guarded the camp's supplies when the herders ranged outward with their livestock. A humble origin for a city that would one day house one of the world's greatest concentrations of learning. Its geography made its destiny. Positioned where the Niger River bends closest to the Saharan trade routes, Timbuktu became the natural exchange point between the desert world of North Africa and the agricultural abundance of the Sudan. Salt moved south. Gold and ivory moved north. And with commerce, inevitably, came people carrying books. By the mid-14th century, that trickle of scholarship had become a flood. The institution that would make Timbuktu legendary was the University of Sankore, though calling it a university in the modern sense requires some imagination. It operated not as a single chartered institution, but as a constellation of schools clustered around the Sankore Mosque, each led by a master scholar whose home functioned as both classroom and library. At its height, Sankore attracted somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 students, in a city whose total population may have reached 100,000. Nearly 1 in 4 residents was engaged in formal study. What did they study? The curriculum was strikingly broad. Islamic jurisprudence formed the core, as students trained in the Maliki legal tradition that governed commerce, inheritance, and governance across much of North Africa. But the scholars of Timbuktu reached further. Astronomy occupied serious minds here, since the precise calculation of prayer times and the lunar calendar demanded genuine mathematical sophistication. Medicine drew students seeking knowledge of treatments and pharmacology that circulated through Arabic translations of Greek and Persian texts. History, rhetoric, and poetry completed an education that its graduates could carry to courts from Cairo to Cordoba. The manuscripts those scholars produced and collected represent perhaps the most tangible legacy of this golden age. Timbuktu's great private libraries held hundreds of thousands of volumes, accumulated across generations by merchant families who understood that books were both intellectual treasure and literal investment. A fine manuscript could command prices comparable to prime real estate. Families like the Keita and the Akit dynasties assembled collections that survived for centuries, and remarkable numbers of these documents survived into the modern era, with estimates ranging upward of 700,000 manuscripts still existing across the region, many only recently cataloged. The city these scholars inhabited was genuinely cosmopolitan. Walking Timbuktu streets in the late 14th century, one might hear Arabic, Songhai, Tamashek, Mandinka, and a half-dozen other languages blending in the markets. Merchants from Morocco, Egypt, and even further afield maintained permanent residences. Ideas about mathematics, navigation, and natural philosophy traveled the same routes as gold dust and cola nuts, absorbed and debated and refined in the study circles gathering each evening in courtyards across the city. Timbuktu was not merely receiving civilization from elsewhere. It was generating it, contributing original legal commentary, historical chronicles, and scientific observation to the broader Islamic intellectual tradition. West African scholars wrote works that were read and cited in North Africa and the Middle East. This was the city that Mansa Musa had seeded with his patronage and his ambition. But even as Timbuktu flourished intellectually, the political structure that had made such flowering possible was beginning to show its first, barely visible cracks. By the 1330s, the Mali Empire had grown into something the medieval world had rarely seen. Stretching roughly 3 million square kilometers from the Atlantic coastline of modern Senegal eastward to the trading city of Gao, and from the Saharan fringe southward into the forested regions near the Guinea coast, it was an entity of staggering scale. More people lived under the Mali emperor's authority than under any contemporary European monarch. To govern such a territory required something beyond personal charisma. It required a system. Mansa Musa and his predecessors had built one. The empire was divided into provinces, each administered by an appointed governor known as a farba. These men were not petty warlords operating independently, but genuine imperial officers, accountable to Niani and expected to maintain order, collect tribute, and ensure the uninterrupted flow of commerce. When disputes arose, they were adjudicated according to a recognizable legal framework rooted in both Islamic precedent and long-standing Mandé custom. Travelers moving through the empire consistently remarked on something remarkable for the era. The roads were safe. The military force that kept them that way was formidable and deliberately composed. The imperial army combined cavalry units, armed with lances and iron weapons, with large formations of infantry archers whose skill with the bow had been refined across generations of both warfare and hunting. Estimates of its size vary, but the army could field tens of thousands of soldiers when fully mobilized. Crucially, much of its daily purpose was not conquest but patrol, protecting the trade arteries along which the empire's wealth traveled. A caravan moving from Timbuktu toward the Saharan crossing points did so under something resembling imperial protection. This was not charity. It was economics. The people sustaining this vast structure lived lives of striking variety. In the Niger River Valley, farmers cultivated millet, sorghum, and rice in the fertile floodplains, producing agricultural surpluses that fed cities and fueled markets. Across the drier zones to the north and west, Fulani herders moved their cattle through seasonal patterns older than the empire itself, paying tribute in animals and dairy products. In the cities and along the trade routes, a merchant class operated with sophisticated commercial arrangements, extending credit, forming partnerships, and calculating exchange rates between gold dust, salt, copper, and cloth. Blacksmiths, weavers, leatherworkers, and potters filled the spaces between. Their crafts organized into professional groups with their own social standing and accumulated expertise. Decades after the empire's peak, the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta visited Mali in 1352 and left behind one of its most detailed portraits. Though he arrived after Mansa Musa's death, the institutions the great Mansa had strengthened were still visible and functioning. Ibn Battuta was struck above all by the quality of justice. He wrote that there was complete security throughout the land and that a traveler need not fear robbers or violent men. He noted with approval that the people were meticulous about prayer, that scholars were respected and well supported, and that the markets operated with an honesty he found admirable. These were not trivial observations from a man who had traveled from Morocco to Constantinople to the Indian subcontinent. Mali impressed him. What Ibn Battuta captured was the texture of an empire at its institutional maturity, a place where generations of accumulated governance had produced something durable. The farming communities fed the cities. The cities generated wealth. The military protected the roots. The Farbis administered the law. And at the center of it all sat the Mansa, distant in his capital yet felt everywhere. But the very scale that made Mali extraordinary also contained the seeds of its eventual fragility. Holding 3 million square kilometers together demanded not just one extraordinary ruler, but a continuous succession of them. Mansa Musa died around 1337. The precise circumstances are lost to the fragmentary record, and even the exact year remains debated among historians, with some sources placing his death as late as 1332 and others as late as 1341. What is not debated is what he left behind. In roughly 25 years on the throne, he had transformed a powerful regional kingdom into an institution of global reputation. His mosques still stood in Timbuktu and Djenné. His scholars still taught in the madrasas he had funded. His diplomatic correspondence had placed Mali on the mental maps of rulers from Morocco to Egypt to the kingdoms of southern Europe. The ledger of his accomplishments was genuinely extraordinary. He had unified religious and civic authority under a single imperial identity without extinguishing the local customs of the diverse peoples under his rule. He had built in stone where others built in mud. He had invited learning into a place that outsiders had regarded as peripheral, and in doing so had made Timbuktu a name that carried genuine intellectual weight across the Islamic world. Caravans moved. Gold flowed. Letters were written and received. By almost any measure available to a medieval ruler, Mansa Musa had succeeded. But success of that magnitude leaves a complicated inheritance. His son, Mansa Musa, assumed the throne and almost immediately revealed the difficulty of following a legend. Magan was not a catastrophically incompetent ruler, but he was an ordinary one, and ordinary was no longer sufficient. The administrative architecture his father had built required constant maintenance, constant attention, and above all, constant authority. A Farba who respected Mansa Musa because of his personal force and demonstrated judgment had no particular reason to extend that same deference to a younger, untested successor. The consequences appeared with troubling speed. Within a few years of Magan's accession, the Mossi people launched a raid on Timbuktu, the great city that Mansa Musa had beautified and enriched. The attackers were repelled, but the fact that they had reached the city at all was a signal. The protective envelope that Musa had maintained through military strength and political coherence was thinning. Worse followed. Tuareg raiders from the Saharan north, long held at a respectful distance by Mali's military reputation, grew bolder. Timbuktu, the jewel of the empire's northern reach, fell temporarily into their hands. It was recovered, but the episode illustrated something important. The empire's borders were only as secure as its center was strong. Historians have long debated whether Mansa Musa's own extraordinary generosity contributed to these vulnerabilities. The pilgrimage of 1324 had been a spectacle of almost incomprehensible expenditure. Gold distributed across Cairo and the Saharan trade routes does not return. Whether the treasury had genuinely been depleted, or whether the administrative weaknesses under Magan were simply the natural entropy of succession remains an open question. Possibly both things were true at once. Magan's reign was brief. He died within a few years of taking power, leaving the throne to pass again. The Mali Empire would continue, and it would produce capable rulers after him. But the singular combination that Mansa Musa had represented, visionary ambition joined to patient administration joined to global awareness, would not be assembled again in quite the same way. The empire Musa built was durable enough to survive his death. Whether it was durable enough to survive the longer pressures gathering at its edges was a question the coming decades would begin to answer. After the turbulence of Mansa Musa's brief reign, the Mali Empire needed someone steady. It found that person in Mansa Suleiman, Musa's brother, who took the throne around 1341. Where Magan had struggled to fill an impossible inheritance, Suleiman approached power with the methodical patience of an administrator rather than the glamour of a conqueror. He tightened the imperial finances. He reasserted authority over governors who had grown comfortable in their distance from the capital. The farther reaches of the empire, which had tested their boundaries during the succession confusion, were reminded that Mali still possessed both the will and the means to enforce its demands. Trade routes stabilized. The gold continued to flow. Suleiman would never carry the legendary weight of his brother's name, but he understood that the daily work of empire is not spectacle. It is maintenance. It was during this period of restored order that Mali received perhaps its most consequential foreign visitor. In 1352, the great Moroccan scholar and traveler Ibn Battuta arrived in Mali. He had already spent decades crossing the known world, from the courts of Central Asia to the coastal cities of East Africa, and his appetite for observation remained undimmed. What he wrote about Mali would survive the centuries as one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of the empire ever recorded. He was not, it should be said, an easy guest. Ibn Battuta arrived with expectations shaped by his own North African assumptions about proper Islamic conduct, and Mali did not always meet them. He criticized the relative freedom of women in Malian society, noting with evident discomfort that educated women move through public life with an independence he found startling. He was troubled by certain court customs he considered incompatible with Islamic dignity, including the practice of attendants covering themselves in dust before the Mansa as a gesture of reverence. But he also recorded his admiration in terms that carried genuine force. He praised the Malians for their absolute commitment to justice. No traveler, he noted, need fear robbery anywhere within the empire's reach. He praised the widespread devotion to Quranic study, the sight of children bound in chains until they had memorized scripture, a practice he found not cruel but disciplined. He described the elaborate ceremony of Suleiman's court with something close to awe: the canopied throne, the hundreds of attendants, the precise rituals through which subjects approached their sovereign. What Ibn Battuta gave posterity was irreplaceable: a human face on an empire that might otherwise exist only in the cold ledger of trade statistics and second-hand diplomatic reports. Suleiman died around 1360, and the palace intrigue that followed his death suggested that even his careful stewardship had not resolved the deeper structural tensions within the empire. Rivals moved quickly. The throne changed hands with unsettling speed. The empire endured. But the long afternoon was beginning, and the shadows at its edges were growing longer. The death of Mansa Suleiman around 1360 left something more dangerous than an empty throne. It left a question no one had convincingly answered in generations. Who, precisely, had the right to sit on it? Mali's succession system carried a flaw at its very heart. Unlike the rigid primogeniture that governed European monarchies of the same era, where the eldest son inherited almost automatically, Mali operated on a far more flexible and therefore far more volatile arrangement. Sons, brothers, and nephews of the previous Mansa could all press legitimate claims. In times of strength, a powerful ruler could impose his chosen successor by sheer force of personality and military loyalty. But in the vulnerable weeks after a ruler's death, that same flexibility became an open invitation to conflict. Suleiman's son, Kamba, moved first. He claimed the throne and initially held it. But within the year, he faced a challenger from a rival branch of the dynasty, the son of the ill-fated Magan, Musa's son, who had briefly and disastrously held power decades earlier. That challenger, Mari Jata II, succeeded in displacing Kamba and seizing control of Niani. What followed was not stability. It was spectacle of a brutal kind. Mari Jata II ruled for roughly 9 years, and those years left a stain on the historical record. Arabic chroniclers, who had praised Suleiman's fiscal discipline and orderly court, wrote of Mari Jata's reign with barely concealed horror. He was, by their accounts, erratic and cruel. The treasury that Suleiman had so carefully rebuilt began to empty again. Provincial governors who had accepted the discipline of a strong center now watched the center wobble and drew their own conclusions. Loyalty, always partly a calculation, began to shift towards self-preservation. When Mary Jata II died around 1373, he had weakened the throne without eliminating the rivalry that produced him. The coups and counter-coups that followed arrived with almost mechanical regularity. Mansa Musa II, Mansa Magan II, names that echo the great figures of Mali's golden age but carry none of their weight. These men reigned in months where their predecessors had reigned in decades. Some were assassinated. Some were deposed so quickly that even contemporary chroniclers struggled to keep the sequence straight. Each transition carried a cost that went beyond the individual ruler. Every coup required promises. Promises to military commanders meant grants of land and autonomy. Promises to provincial governors meant reduced oversight, lower tribute, greater independence. The empire did not break apart all at once. It dissolved gradually, one negotiated concession at a time. The provinces felt this most acutely. The Songhai people to the east, centered on the great bend of the Niger River, had long existed within Mali's orbit rather than under its direct grip. Through the middle decades of the 14th century, that distinction had mattered less because Mali's military reach remained credible. Now, watching the succession crises consume the capital's energy and attention, the Songhai began to test the limits of their autonomy with growing confidence. They were not yet ready to break free entirely. But the calculation was changing. The Wolof and other Western peoples along the Senegal River watched with similar attention. Tribute paid to a powerful empire is a rational investment in security. Tribute paid to a court consumed by its own internal bloodletting begins to feel like a different proposition altogether. This is the cruel arithmetic of imperial decline. Weakness invites the very challenges that deepen the weakness. Each rival claimant who raised an army to contest the throne drew soldiers and resources away from the frontiers. Each frontier that grew less secure encouraged further defiance. The feedback loop, once established, proved extraordinarily difficult to break. By the closing years of the 14th century, the Mali Empire still existed. Its name still commanded respect across the wider Islamic world, carried by the memories of Mansa Musa and the reports of Ibn Battuta. But the empire behind that name was shrinking. And from the east, something new was beginning to stir. Far to the east of Niani, beyond the great arc of the Niger River, a people had been watching Mali's unraveling with careful eyes. The Songhai had lived along the Niger bend for centuries before any Keita king had claimed authority over them. Their city, Gao, sat at one of the most strategically valuable points in all of West Africa, where trans-Saharan trade routes from the north converged with the river highway running east and west. Merchants moved through Gao the way water moves through a channel, and the Songhai understood, as all river people do, that whoever controls the channel controls what flows through it. Mali had absorbed Gao into its orbit during the empire's expansive years under Mansa Musa and his predecessors. The relationship was never one of equals. The Songhai paid tribute. They acknowledged Malian authority. But geography had always granted them a certain insulation. Gao lay far from Niani, far from the soldiers and administrators who enforced the Mansa's will, and proximity has always mattered more than proclamations in the business of empire. Through the turmoil of the late 14th century, that distance became an asset. While Mali's court consumed itself in succession disputes, the Songhai ruling dynasty, known as the Sunni line, quietly expanded its own reach. There were no dramatic declarations of independence, no single moment of open defiance. There was simply, year by year, a loosening of the ties that had bound Gao to the south and west. By the early 1500s, those ties had frayed almost completely. The Songhai were operating as a sovereign power in all but name, conducting their own diplomacy, managing their own trade revenues, and building their own military capacity. Mali still claimed authority. The Songhai no longer felt the need to contest the claim directly. They simply behaved as though it did not apply to them. What transformed this quiet independence into open conquest was the arrival of one extraordinary man. Sunni Ali Burr came to power around 1464, and from the moment he assumed the Songhai throne, the pace of events in the Western Sudan accelerated dramatically. He was, by every account that survives, a commander of ferocious energy and tactical brilliance. Where previous Songhai rulers had been content to consolidate, Sunni Ali Burr moved to expand, and he moved fast. His army combined infantry and a formidable river fleet, a weapon uniquely suited to the geography of the Niger Bend. He could project force overland and by water simultaneously, giving his campaigns a flexibility that opponents struggled to match. The surrounding peoples who had lived between Songhai and Mali, calculating their allegiances year by year, now faced a force that could reach them from directions they had not anticipated. And then came 1468. Timbuktu, the city that had dazzled the Islamic world when Mansa Musa transformed it into a center of scholarship and faith, fell to Sunni Ali Burr's forces that year. The symbolic weight of this event is difficult to overstate. Timbuktu had been the intellectual and spiritual crown of Mali's golden age. Its great mosques and madrasas carried the memory of everything the empire had once represented. To lose it was not simply a military defeat. It was a statement, heard across the Sahara and beyond, that a new power now commanded the heartland of West Africa. For Mali, still clinging to its identity in the south and west, the fall of Timbuktu marked a point of no return. The empire had lost its richest cities, its most celebrated scholars, and the trade revenues that had once funded everything from royal pilgrimages to frontier armies. What remained was a rump state, proud in name, diminished in fact, and facing pressures it no longer had the strength to resist. Timbuktu was only the beginning. As the 15th century wore on, Mali found itself assailed not from one direction but from all of them simultaneously. An empire that had once imposed order across an area larger than Western Europe now struggled to defend its own borders against enemies who sensed, with the instinct of predators, that the old giant was finally failing. From the north came the Tuareg. These nomadic Berber warriors had always moved through the Saharan margins on their own terms, tolerating Malian authority when it suited them and ignoring it when it did not. Now they moved decisively. Caravan cities that had once fed Mali's treasury fell under Tuareg control, and with them went the northern trade routes. The caravans still moved. The gold and salt still changed hands. But the revenues flowed to new masters now, leaving Niani's court increasingly starved of the wealth that had sustained it. From the south, the Mossi cavalry struck with brutal regularity. Based on the Volta Plateau, the Mossi kingdoms had raided Malian territory for generations, but where earlier Malian rulers had possessed the military depth to absorb and repel these incursions, the empire of the late 15th century could no longer marshal an effective response. Mossy horsemen drove deep into territories that had once been beyond their reach, targeting towns and trade depots that the weakened Mansa could not protect. From the west came perhaps the quietest but most permanent unraveling. The provinces that had once formed Mali's Atlantic frontier began to peel away. The Wolof and Jolof peoples organized their own political structures, their own kingdoms, their own futures, no longer waiting for direction or protection from a distant court that could offer neither. Secession required no dramatic declaration. It simply happened province by province as local leaders stopped acknowledging an authority that had ceased to mean anything. And then from the sea itself came a force no Malian king had ever anticipated. Portuguese navigators had been pushing steadily down the West African coast through the middle decades of the 15th century. By the 1470s and 1480s, they had established trading contacts along the Senegambian coast, introducing a new commercial geography that bypassed the old Saharan routes entirely. Goods that had once traveled north across the desert to Mediterranean markets could now move west, directly to European ships waiting at anchor. The axis of West African trade was rotating, and Mali, an inland empire built entirely around the northern routes, had no way to reposition itself. By the closing years of the 1500s, the territory under any meaningful Malian authority had contracted to the Mandinka heartland near the Upper Niger, the original core from which the Keita dynasty had launched its remarkable ascent 2.5 centuries earlier. What had once encompassed an empire now encompassed a memory. And yet, even in that diminished heartland, something endured, stubborn and unextinguished, waiting to be reckoned with one final time. What rises in the shadow of a fallen empire? Sometimes, something greater still. By 1493, the Songhai Empire had already consumed much of what Mali once controlled. But the man who seized its throne that year would transform a powerful kingdom into something that beggared comparison with anything West Africa had seen before. His name was Muhammad Tur, and history would remember him as Askia Muhammad the Great. He came to power not through royal birth, but through a military coup, overthrowing the son of Sunni Ali, the warrior king who had first broken Malian dominance over the Niger Bend. Where Sunni Ali had been a conqueror indifferent to Islamic learning, Askia Muhammad was a devout and calculating ruler who understood that legitimacy in the Saharan world required more than battlefield victories. It required the blessing of scholars, clerics, and the faithful networks of Muslim merchants who kept the trade routes alive. His first declaration of that legitimacy came just 2 years after seizing power. In 1495, Askia Muhammad departed from Mecca on the Hajj, traveling with a retinue of scholars and an estimated 300,000 gold pieces, a display of wealth deliberately calibrated to announce that a new great power had risen in the Western Sudan. In Cairo, he received the title of Caliph of the Western Sudan from the Abbasid Caliph in exile, a symbolic investiture that carried enormous weight across the Islamic world. He returned home not merely a king, but a figure of continental religious authority. What followed was a systematic absorption of every significant city and trade artery that Mali had once claimed: Jenny, Timbuktu, Walata. One by one, the great nodes of trans-Saharan commerce came fully under Songhai administration. Askia Muhammad established professional bureaucracies, standardized weights and measures across the empire, and transformed Timbuktu into one of the world's preeminent centers of Islamic scholarship. At its height, the city's Sankor Mosque functioned as a university drawing scholars from across North Africa and the Middle East. Through all of this expansion, Mali's remaining territories contracted further still. Songhai military campaigns pushed repeatedly against the Mandinka heartland, stripping away whatever peripheral authority the Mansa still claimed. By the early decades of the 1500s, the once magnificent Keita dynasty presided over little more than the chieftaincy of Kangaba, the ancient ancestral homeland near the upper Niger from which their empire had first emerged centuries before. There was something almost geometric about it. The empire had grown outward from this small core, expanded until it encompassed kingdoms and deserts and coastlines, and now had contracted back, like a tide withdrawing, until only the original ground remained. Mali had not vanished. Not yet. But it had become a relic, a chieftaincy where an empire had once stood, surrounded now by the vast apparatus of a successor that had learned from everything Mali had built. And Askia Muhammad Songhai would face its own reckoning soon enough. And yet Mali endured. Diminished, encircled, stripped of every great city it had once claimed, the Keita dynasty refused to dissolve entirely. The Mansa still held court at Kangaba. They still bore the ancient title. And in 1445, Mansa Mahmud II made one final, desperate attempt to reclaim something of what had been lost. His target was Timbuktu, the intellectual jewel that had once made Mali the envy of the known world. His forces marched northeast, carrying with them whatever remained of Malian military ambition. The assault failed. Songhai defenders repelled the attack, and with it died the last serious military effort to restore Keita authority beyond the ancestral heartland. Mahmud II retreated, and the borders of Mali's shrunken world closed tighter still. Then, in 1591, something unexpected reshaped the entire region in a single season. A Moroccan army crossed the Sahara armed with gunpowder weapons that the Songhai cavalry had no answer for. At the Battle of Tondibi, the greatest empire West Africa had produced in the 16th century collapsed within hours. The Moroccan force was small, barely 4,000 soldiers, but their arquebuses and cannons made numbers almost irrelevant. Askia Ishaq II fled. Songhai fractured into competing successor states almost immediately. For Mali, this catastrophe next door was neither salvation nor opportunity. The Moroccan forces that occupied Timbuktu and Djenné brought their own instability, their own appetites. The entire Niger Bend descended into decades of fragmentation and conflict. Trade routes that had sustained the region for centuries became dangerous and unreliable. The commercial networks that had made empires possible slowly withered. The small Mandan state under the later Keita rulers survived this chaos partly through irrelevance. There was simply not enough left to make conquest worthwhile. The Mansas governed a modest territory, preserved their ceremonial dignity, and maintained the old lineages and traditions that connected them to Sundiata's founding moment, now 3.5 centuries in the past. Gradually, even this diminished sovereignty faded. By the mid-17th century, the Mandan state had ceased to function as a meaningful political entity. No single dramatic defeat ended it. No conqueror claimed the final victory. It simply dissolved, absorbed into the broader landscape of competing Mandinka chieftaincies and the regional powers rising around them. What persisted was something harder to govern and impossible to conquer. The Keita lineage continued. Mandinka identity, language, and cultural memory survived with remarkable resilience across a vast geographic spread, carried by traders, griots, and communities from Senegambia to the forests of Guinea. The story of Sundiata remained alive in oral tradition, as vivid and consequential as ever. Empires, it turns out, can end without their peoples disappearing. What the Keita built outlasted the Keita themselves, woven into the fabric of a people who carried it forward long after the last Mansa's name was forgotten. While the political structures of the Mali Empire crumbled and the last Mansas faded into obscurity, something extraordinary had taken root in the desert city of Timbuktu. Centuries of scholarship, commerce, and faith had produced a written legacy so vast that its true scale would not be understood until modern times. The numbers alone are staggering. Scholars estimate that between 300,000 and 700,000 manuscripts survive in Timbuktu and the surrounding region. Written primarily in Arabic, but also in local languages using Arabic script, these documents cover an almost unimaginable range of human inquiry. Theology and Islamic jurisprudence sit alongside treatises on astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Poetry shares shelf space with histories of West African kingdoms. One manuscript contains detailed guidance on the treatment of eye disease. Another records lunar calculations of striking precision. These were not simple devotional texts. They were the working documents of a sophisticated, literate civilization. For centuries, the manuscripts survived because of family devotion. Timbuktu's great scholarly families treated their collections as sacred inheritances, hiding books behind false walls, burying them in desert sand, and passing preservation responsibilities from generation to generation. The manuscripts were rarely discussed with outsiders. Their existence was an open secret that the wider world simply chose not to investigate. That began to change in the late 20th century. The Ahmed Baba Institute, founded in 1973 and named for Timbuktu's most celebrated 16th century scholar, became the center of international preservation efforts. South African funding, Norwegian archival expertise, and European Union resources combined to digitize tens of thousands of documents, creating copies that could survive whatever fate might befall the originals. Then came 2012, and the fragility of everything became terrifyingly clear. Islamist militants affiliated with Al-Qaeda seized northern Mali, including Timbuktu, in the spring of that year. The world watched in horror as fighters destroyed ancient shrines and monuments they deemed idolatrous. The manuscripts, representing the full breadth of human learning, were suddenly in extraordinary danger. Some militants regarded the books as evidence of heretical tradition. Others simply saw them as objects to be sold, burned, or used as leverage. What followed was one of history's quieter acts of heroism. Abdulkader Haidara, a manuscript collector and librarian, organized a covert operation of breathtaking scale. Using donated funds and networks of trusted couriers, his team packed thousands of manuscripts into footlockers and metal trunks, smuggling them south through checkpoints and across the Niger River. Over many months, an estimated 370,000 manuscripts were transported to Bamako, Mali's capital, hidden in plain sight among ordinary cargo. When French military intervention finally dislodged the militants in early 2013, some manuscripts were burned. But the great majority survived, carried out by ordinary people who understood precisely what they were saving. The written memory of one of history's greatest civilizations endures today because those people refused to let it disappear. What does it mean for a story to never die? Across West Africa today, in village squares and at ceremonial gatherings, men in elaborate robes take up the kora, the ancient harp lute of the Mande people, and begin to speak. They are griots, the living keepers of memory, and what they perform is the Sundiata epic, the founding story of the Mali Empire, recited in an unbroken chain stretching back nearly 8 centuries. The names, the battles, the Lion King's miraculous rise from childhood paralysis to imperial glory, these are not museum pieces. They pulse with life. Each performance is both ancient and immediate, shaped by the griot's own artistry, offered to an audience who knows the story yet leans forward anyway. This is what survival looks like. The Mandinka people, direct cultural descendants of the Mali Empire's heartland, carry that inheritance across an enormous geography. From Senegambia to Guinea-Bissau, from Sierra Leone to the Gambia, Mandinka language, music, and social structure reflect the civilization Sundiata built. And through the brutal machinery of the Atlantic slave trade, that heritage crossed an ocean. Scholars have traced Mandinka cultural fingerprints into communities across the Caribbean and the American South. The rhythmic structures of certain blues traditions, the particular weaving patterns of Gullah communities along the Carolina coast, the persistence of specific naming practices, all point back, however faintly, to the world the Mali Empire made. Then there is Mansa Musa. His extraordinary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 has found new audiences in the 21st century in ways that would have astonished any medieval observer. When economists began calculating historical wealth in modern terms and concluded that Mansa Musa may have been the single richest human being who ever lived, the story traveled everywhere. Social media carried his portrait across millions of screens. His name appeared in textbooks, documentary films, and video games. Suddenly, a 14th century West African king was a household reference for the sheer, almost incomprehensible scale of human wealth. That popular recognition matters, but the deeper work happens more quietly. Archaeologists are excavating sites across the former empire's territory, recovering the physical texture of daily life. Historians trained in both Western academic methods and African oral traditions are producing scholarship that takes the griots seriously as primary sources, not colorful supplements to real history. The manuscripts rescued from Timbuktu are being studied, cataloged, and translated, revealing a civilization that was literate, cosmopolitan, and intellectually ambitious centuries before European contact. The story of Mali asks something important of us. It asks whether we are willing to revise what we thought we knew about the past, about which civilizations mattered, about where great ideas grew and great wealth flowed. The lion's roar faded long ago from the banks of the Niger. But the echo, carried by griots and scholars and the rescued manuscripts of a desert city, reaches us still, growing clearer every year. The Mali Empire's golden legacy endures in every manuscript saved, every story passed down, and every map redrawn to reflect what the world forgot. Subscribe for more histories that deserve to be heard.